Hello, it's John Heaton, and I'm back after a bit of a holiday. Good to be back. So, a few things to tell you about. When I was in Guernsey for a week, which is an island off the coast of France, which belongs to the UK, and it was the 60th anniversary of the Beatles, playing in Guernsey, August the 8th, 1963. So, there was a little exhibition I went to, and couldn't believe it, but there was a signed headed notepaper of the Duke of Richmond Hotel, signed by all four Beatles, and I asked the lady behind the desk if it was original. She said yes. Have to say the security wasn't brilliant there, so if one had wanted to, I think one could have probably, someone could have walked off with it, but anyway, I digress. It was nice to see that, and I actually went round the corner to the Duke of Richmond Hotel and asked if there were any pictures of the Beatles stay there, and they rather disappointingly sort of shrugged their shoulders and said no. Anyway, so I'm going to review Please Please Me today, the Beatles' first album, and this was partially prompted by a discussion I had in the pub in Wimbledon the other day with a friend of mine who claimed that the Beatles' sound was dated, and said Here Comes the Sun is the best song they did because it doesn't sound dated. And I said, that's a bit strange, and then we got into discussing it, and I concluded it was just the early Beatles which may sound dated. But then I got to thinking, well, even the early Beatles isn't really dated. I mean, maybe it's a basic sound, but it still sounds pretty fresh. And this album I'm going to review or revisit today, I think sounds pretty fresh. A couple of things before I get into the album. I was listening to, because Joe Brown was big in the UK in 1962. I think he was voted biggest vocal personality of 1962 in the UK, and he had a hit called Picture of You, and I was just stumbling across, because he played at the concert for George a year after George's death, and I just stumbled across this album of his the other day. It's from 2012 called the Ukulele Album, and I highly recommend it. It's a really fun listen. It's got superb cover versions of McGuinness Flint, When I'm Dead and Gone, Mr. Blue Sky, ELO, When I'm Cleaning Windows, George Formby, There Ain't No Pleasing You, Chaz and Dave, Where Were You Last Night, Travelling Wilburys, Pinball Wizard, The Who, I'm Not in Love, 10cc, I'll See You in My Dreams, which is what he performed at the concert for George, a song called Hula Girl, You've Got Your Troubles, I've Got Mine, Tickle My Heart, I Like Ukuleles, The Ace of Spades from Motorhead, which is hilariously covered into some kind of mad skiffle workout, and then a song called I Like You, and then a hilarious song at the end, I Like Bananas because they have no bones, and I don't like politicians, can't stand mobile phones, but I like bananas because they have no bones. It's a very fun song. Anyway, just thought I'd mention that. Joe Brown, big mate to the Beatles in the early 60s. So Please Please Me came out 22nd of March 1963, and their debut album, and it lasts for 31 minutes 59 seconds, so it was kind of palatable length, unlike nowadays where you struggle to get an album lasting less than an hour for the most part. This was a decent length. Obviously we know what happened in the US, which was even shorter, but I think this is a decent length for an album. And the history is they'd recorded two previous singles to this album, Please Please Me and Love Me Do, with their respective B-sides. So they had 4 tracks in the can, and then they went into the studio on the 11th of February 1963 and just completed the album. So they recorded 10 tracks in the space of a day, which is pretty staggering, really. George didn't like the cover, apparently. I guess it's not as arty as with the Beatles, but I think it works, and obviously this shot was recreated in 1969 to bring the whole thing full circle. So I like no problems with the cover, in my opinion. One interesting thing about this album, before we get to discuss the music, is that the original songs composed by the Beatles were credited to McCartney-Lennon, not Lennon-McCartney, and I'm just thinking why that would be the case. Maybe it was because Paul was slightly stronger musically at the time than John, but it doesn't really make much sense because Lennon was, by all intents and purposes, the leader of the group. So maybe he just gave through Paul a bone and said, okay, you can be the lead in terms of the songwriting partnership. But I'm glad they changed it round because Lennon-McCartney makes more sense. And as you probably heard me express before, I'm not a big fan of McCartney trying to reverse that for songs that he wrote, because I really don't think it makes any difference. And history will revere and remember Lennon and McCartney the same way as they revere and remember Gilbert and Sullivan and Rodgers and Hammerstein, and you wouldn't have it any other way. So anyway, on this album it's McCartney-Lennon, which is slightly strange. Anyway, to the music. What a way to open the first album with I Saw Her Standing There, which is one of Paul's best ever tracks, certainly one of his best early tracks, and a storming vocal. And this was during the era where Paul perhaps wasn't as confident behind the mic as he would become. And so this is quite a standout for him in this period, because if you look at the other songs he's singing lead vocal on, like Hold Me Tight, which was recorded from this album and left over with the Beatles, and P.S. I Love You, and bits of Love Me Do, his delivery is not that confident, but on this one he's absolutely going for the vocal. And as we know, Lennon contributed bits and pieces to the lyric, and it just makes a storming opener to the album, what Lennon would describe as a pot boiler, or he said that George Martin used to describe this kind of song as a pot boiler, a good one to open the album. And then it carries on in with remarkable consistent quality throughout the album, really, and Misery is a very underrated Lennon-McCartney track, with lovely singing from John. It's not quite double-tracked at this stage, although it sounds a bit like it, and Paul coming in and doing harmony vocal, and then George Martin overdubbed a piano bit a few days later, apparently. So that's a really nice track, and I don't think Paul has ever performed this in concert. He should do, although Lennon does take the lead, it's true. Anna is a superb cover of an Arthur Alexander song, and this is an example of the Beatles perhaps not going for the obvious cover material, because there's no Chuck Berry covers on this, there's no Buddy Holly covers on this album. They've gone for a more obscure artist called Arthur Alexander, who they discovered from America, and they'd listened to his records and loved them, and the Rolling Stones would also record You Better Move On from Arthur Alexander, and the Beatles would record two of his other songs for the BBC radio series, Soldier of Love and Shot of Rhythm and Blues. And this one is sung beautifully by Lennon, and great harmony vocals from Paul and George, and it's an absolute one of their best covers, I think. Chains the vocal is given to George to sing. It's a Goffin and King number. It's quite well done, quite energetic, and then Ringo's given the spotlight for Boys, which is not my favourite, but he does a decent job on the vocal, and he would sing it live in concert. Ask Me Why is an early Lennon attempt to write a song, not bad, sort of learning the ropes, and some quite nice melody in this song. Nothing outstanding at this stage. And then Please Please Me was their first number one single, if you accept that it was number one in most of the charts, not the official chart at the time in the UK, but every other chart it hit number one. So it's very much regarded as a number one single, but unfortunately, because it wasn't number one in the official chart, it didn't make this compilation, which is a bit of a travesty, because it's an absolutely top-notch Beatles single, and just really well sung by John and Paul, and just a tour de force. And then you turn over the record and you get their first single, Love Me Do, which George Martin did not believe had much hit potential, and was quite surprised it got all the way to 17. By the way, Please Please Me obviously started off as a slower number, and George Martin said speed it up, and to the song's benefit, because it sounded a bit like a Roy Orbison number to begin with. So that was a good input from George Martin. P.S. I Love You had been the B-side of Love Me Do, and it's a very nice song from Paul, tapping into the sort of sentimental vein that he would tap into for years to come, but nothing wrong with that. And Baby It's You is a nice cover with John taking the lead, David Williams Bacharach, who wrote that song. And then Do You Want to Know Secret is a Lennon-McCartney song, or McCartney-Lennon as it was covered here, as it was credited here, and George is given this song to sing, and he sings it very nicely. Taste of Honey is probably the weakest track on the album. When I was trying to remember the tracks off the top of my head of this album the other day, without prompt, without cheating or anything, I could name all of them apart from one, and I just couldn't remember the last track for about an hour and a half. and it was annoying me. And they eventually got it, Taste of Honey, but I think it's fair to say it's my least favourite track on the album, and I think there's many other songs from their live repertoire they could have done instead of this one, but small criticism. There's a Place, a very early example of Lennon exploring the kind of, in my mind, kind of lyric that he would explore a lot in later years, but this is an early example of that and very, very effective. And Twist and Shout, I was just looking at the other day, is number 5, the 5th most popular Beatles song on Spotify, and I could see why, because it's an absolutely storming cover, and it absolutely blows the original out of the water. With all due respect to the original, the Isley Brothers, this Beatles version is, in my opinion, the definitive version of this song, and it's just raucously sung by John. Almost lost his voice, left it to the end of the session to do, and then finished off the session with hit. And then they tried another take, and he couldn't get through the song, so they went with the take 1. So that was Please Please Me. I think it's a very fresh album, and there are times when, particularly when I'm prompted by a friend annoying me saying the Beatles are dated, I think, well, I go back and listen to the early stuff, and it's not really that dated at all. You play it through a good hi-fi, and you can hear the band cooking, and it's a fair approximation of their live act at the time. I think the Guernsey set list had quite a bit of this album in the set list. And then we've got this EP with an alternative shot from the same session where Ringo looks like a sort of stand-in android. He just doesn't look like Ringo at all. Would you agree? It's quite amusing. And then obviously the Blue album and the Red album has another shot, alternative shot from the same session, which is subtly different from that, if you look. Apart from the fact the album cover of Please Please Me is more in focus. This is a bit out of focus. So anyway, those 3 shots were used in various ways. And this is the Twist and Shout EP with 4 tracks taken from the album. And this picture was taken in Liverpool, but taken by a photographer who was born in Guernsey. So she wrote about it in the exhibition I saw at in St. Peter Port the other day. So that was Please Please Me. I think it's often overlooked, should I say. And, there's some absolutely storming numbers on the album. I mean, I would highlight, I saw her standing there, Twist and Shout and Please Please Me as being absolutely top-notch Beatles, and tracks like Misery and Anna are pretty damn good sort of, relatively obscure tracks by Beatles standards. So that was Please Please Me. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.